Step away from the pump.
I'm telling you, this is official work.
Yeah, official for who?
Law enforcement. You need to slow down and verify before you touch anything here.
No, you need to explain why you pumping stolen fuel.
Stolen fuel? You haven't even checked
Don't
anything.
tell me what I checked.
Then check it.
ID, right now.
I already told you who I am. Call the supervisor and verify.
This is why you never let a badge replace facts. When a patrol officer rolled up on a black man at a gas station and accused him of stealing fuel, he expected fear, excuses, and quick compliance. What he got instead was a calm federal investigator in the middle of a sanctioned operation. And the second that truth came out, the officer knew he had pushed the wrong man in the worst possible place. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you follow stories about profiling, abuse of power, and real accountability, like the video and subscribe. This started in the middle of a working investigation, not in the middle of some random misunderstanding. The man at the pump was Adrian Cole. He was a federal investigator, mid-40s, plainclothes, unmarked vehicle, active field assignment. He was tracking a fuel fraud case tied to stolen commercial card data and coordinated purchases across state lines. He wasn't there for gas on the way home. He was watching a target, logging movements, and waiting for the next step in the operation. The officer who turned it into a public scene was Tyler Boone, a city patrol cop who had a habit of acting first and sorting out facts later. He came into that station already convinced he was about to catch somebody. That confidence lasted right up until he understood who Adrian really was. The gas station sat near an interstate exit in a busy retail strip. Early evening, bright canopy lights, cars coming in and out, security cameras over the pumps in the storefront, a cashier inside, a few customers close enough to hear the officer's voice the moment he got loud. Boone spotted Adrian near the pump and locked onto him fast. He looked at the plainclothes, looked at the vehicle, saw a black man standing there, and decided he had a theft case before he asked a single useful question. He didn't start by checking the plate. He didn't ask station staff what was going on. He didn't approach like somebody trying to understand a situation. He walked in like he'd already written the report in his head. He got out of his cruiser and started giving commands right away. He accused Adrian of pumping stolen fuel. He demanded identification. He ordered him to keep his hands visible and stop moving. His tone wasn't controlled. It was aggressive from the start, the kind officers use when they want to dominate a scene before anyone can challenge them. Adrian didn't match that energy. He stayed steady. He kept his movements limited. He told Boone he was law enforcement and that the officer needed to verify before interfering any further. That should have slowed things down. It didn't. Boone took that response as defiance. He stepped closer and repeated the accusation like volume could make it true. He talked over Adrian. He acted like the issue was settled and all that remained was getting the suspect into cuffs. That was the first clear sign he cared more about control than procedure. Adrian tried again. He told Boone in a measured way that this was official work and that a supervisor needed to be contacted before Boone touched anything tied to the scene. He wasn't trying to win an argument. He was trying to stop a patrol officer from damaging an active operation. Boone pushed harder. He moved into Adrian's space and started using physical presence, the way some officers do when they think size and pressure will get them what facts haven't. He positioned himself between Adrian and the vehicle. He kept talking about theft. He started warning him about detention. He made it sound like force was the next step if Adrian didn't comply exactly the way Boone wanted. The problem for Boone was simple. Adrian didn't look like a thief trying to escape. He looked like a professional trying to keep a reckless officer from making a bigger mistake. Anyone who took 2 seconds to read the scene could see it. A customer near the next row of pumps raised a phone and started recording. Another followed. The cashier inside stopped pretending to be busy and watched through the glass. Boone either didn't notice or thought none of it would matter later. It mattered. Because once the scene was on camera, every bad decision had a timestamp. Boone still hadn't verified who Adrian was. He still hadn't called in the plate. He still hadn't checked whether another agency was working nearby. He just kept pressing the accusation. That wasn't good police work. That was ego mixed with profiling, and it was getting more obvious by the second. Adrian kept his voice level. He said enough to make clear that Boone was heading into territory he did not understand. He did not argue for the crowd. He did not start a shouting match. He gave the officer chances to back up and do this correctly. Boone didn't take them. A second patrol unit pulled in. The backup officer got out slower and read the situation better right away. He saw Adrian's posture. He saw Boone's aggression. He saw the phones out. He looked like he already understood the stop was going bad. Boone kept driving it in the wrong direction. He started talking about handcuffs, like he was already committed to making an arrest. That was the point where this stopped looking like a heated misunderstanding and started looking like liability. An officer had moved from accusation to threatened force without taking the basic steps to confirm identity. He had built the whole encounter on assumption. Adrian knew exactly what kind of officer he was dealing with by then. Not the careful kind. Not the disciplined kind. Boone was one of those patrol cops who treated being questioned as disrespect and treated calm behavior like a challenge to his authority. Then Boone noticed a document pouch Adrian had kept close to his side. That caught his attention immediately. He started focusing on it. Adrian shifted slightly to keep Boone from grabbing it, and Boone reacted like that movement proved criminal intent. He closed distance again, escalated his commands, and reached toward Adrian's arm as if he was about to force the issue. That was the moment this whole thing crossed from bad judgment into serious misconduct. Because Boone still believed he was handling a suspected thief at a gas pump. He had no idea he was about to put hands on a federal investigator in the middle of a sanctioned operation. And once that next second arrived, his whole attitude was going to collapse. Boone's hand had barely moved before Adrian stopped him with a clear warning and a tone that finally cut through the officer's noise. Adrian told him not to touch the pouch, not to touch the vehicle, and not to interfere with federal property. He said it like a man who knew exactly where the line was and knew Boone had already stepped too close to it. Boone didn't process the warning the way a careful officer would have. He heard the word federal and treated it like a bluff. That's what made this so bad. He'd built the whole encounter around his own first impression, and by now he was too deep into it to admit he might have been wrong. So instead of slowing down, he tried to overpower the situation before it slipped away from him. He told Adrian to stop talking. He said he was done with the excuses. He reached again, this time more openly, like he was going to seize the pouch and sort it out himself. Adrian moved one step back and brought the pouch forward just enough to control it, not enough to look combative. Then he opened it. That changed everything. Inside was a federal credential wallet and a signed operation packet. Not some cheap badge, not a novelty shield, real credentials, agency seal, photo match, assignment paperwork. The kind of documents patrol officers are trained to stop and verify, not argue with in front of a crowd. Boone looked at them for a second and still tried to hold on to the stop. He said something about fake IDs and said anyone could print papers. Bad move, real bad. At that point, he wasn't investigating. He was resisting reality because reality made him look reckless. Adrian kept control of the scene better than Boone did, and that was obvious to everybody standing there. He held the credentials where Bodycam and phone cameras could catch them. He identified himself fully. He stated that he was engaged in a sanctioned operation. He told Boone to call his supervisor and verify through dispatch immediately. That second officer finally stepped in a little closer. Not enough to challenge Boone directly, but enough to show he understood the problem now. He looked at the credentials, then at Boone, and you could tell he wanted this to slow down before it got worse. Too late for that. Dispatch came over Boone's radio while he was still trying to talk over Adrian. The message wasn't loud enough for the whole station to hear every word, but it was loud enough for the important part. There was an interagency notification on file. Federal personnel were operating in the area. The location matched. Boone's face changed right there. Not all at once. First confusion. Then the quick blank look people get when they realize the story they've been telling themselves just fell apart. Then panic. Small at first, then obvious. Adrian didn't let him talk his way around it. He put the credentials back in the pouch, kept his posture steady, and told Boone he had been warned more than once to verify before escalating. He said Boone had interfered with an active operation, made a criminal accusation without confirming identity, and threatened force in a situation he did not understand. Now Boone started sounding different. The swagger dropped out of his voice. He said he was only responding to what looked suspicious. He said he was doing his job. He said Adrian could have identified himself sooner, like this had happened because the target of his aggression hadn't made it easy enough for him. That excuse died fast, because everyone there had just watched Adrian do exactly that. More than once, calmly, clearly. Boone ignored it because he didn't want an answer. He wanted compliance from the person he'd already decided was guilty. Then Adrian's phone rang through the secure line clipped inside his jacket. It was his supervisor. He answered, gave his name, and put the call on speaker, just long enough for the chain of command to enter the scene without ever stepping out of a vehicle. Supervisory Agent Lena Velez came on sharp and direct. She identified herself, confirmed Adrian's status, confirmed the operation, and asked for the patrol officer's name and badge number. That was the moment Boone fully understood. He was no longer managing a gas station stop. He was explaining himself to people above his pay grade, with witnesses, video, and radio traffic behind all of it. He gave his name, gave the badge number. His words came out slower now, less force, more caution. He tried one more version of the same defense, saying the situation looked like possible fuel theft, and he had to act quickly. Velez shut that down. She asked whether he had verified the vehicle before accusing Adrian. He hadn't. She asked whether he had contacted a supervisor before threatening detention of someone claiming law enforcement status. He hadn't. She asked whether he had made physical contact or attempted to seize federal documents. He started answering that one carefully, which told everyone enough. The backup officer looked like he wanted to disappear. The two customers were still recording. The cashier inside had moved closer to the glass. Boone could feel the audience now because the audience had stopped being useful to him. Adrian stayed measured. That's what made Boone look even worse. He wasn't being baited. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't trying to embarrass Boone for sport. He was documenting him in real time. Big difference. One man was trying to control himself. The other had already shown he couldn't control a routine contact. Then Velez told Boone to stop all interference, clear the scene, and wait for a supervisor, because her office would be making formal contact with the department before the hour was over. That landed. Boone nodded before catching himself and remembering she couldn't see him. Then he said he understood, quietly. Nothing like the man who had stormed in minutes earlier, acting like he owned the place. He stepped back from Adrian for the first time since this started. Really stepped back. Not tactical repositioning. Retreat. Adrian didn't chase the moment. He didn't pile on. He adjusted the pouch, checked the vehicle, and made sure nothing tied to the operation had been disturbed. Then he looked at Boone and said the part Boone was going to hear again in reports, reviews, and probably depositions. He said authority means nothing when procedure disappears. That line hit because it was true, and everybody there knew it. A field supervisor from Boone's department arrived a few minutes later and got the ugly version first. Phone video, Bodycam, dispatch confirmation. Federal supervisor already involved. There was no room left for Boone to frame this as a close call or a confusing stop. The facts were too clean. The sergeant separated the officers, spoke briefly with Adrian, looked at the credentials, and his whole expression tightened. He knew what kind of paperwork was coming. He also knew this wasn't just about one bad interaction. This was a public example of an officer going aggressive before getting basic facts, and the profiling angle was impossible to ignore. Adrian gave a concise statement right there. He explained why he was at the station, how Boone approached, what warnings had been given, and exactly when Boone escalated to threats and attempted interference. He didn't need to embellish anything. The officer had done enough on his own. Boone stood off to the side trying to recover a version of himself that no longer fit the scene. He wasn't commanding anything now. He wasn't directing traffic, controlling hands, or throwing around accusations. He was just a patrol officer waiting for his supervisor to decide how much of his career he had burned in one stop. And the worst part for him was this. The whole thing had started because he saw a black man in plainclothes and trusted his own bias more than protocol. That truth was all over the footage. The fallout started before Boone even left the gas station. By the time his supervisor finished the first round of questions, the video was already moving. One customer posted a clip that showed the accusation, the threats, and the exact shift in Boone's voice after Adrian's credentials came out. Another angle showed Boone closing distance and reaching toward the document pouch after being warned to stop. That part mattered because it killed any later attempt to describe the encounter as calm or routine. Adrian went back to work that night, but the stop had already damaged the operation. Once a patrol officer creates a loud scene at an active surveillance location, the whole environment changes. People notice, targets notice, patterns break. The federal team had to shut down that phase early and review what had been compromised. That made Boone's mistake bigger than one bad street encounter. He hadn't just embarrassed himself, he had interfered with a live investigation. The next morning, Adrian filed a formal incident memorandum through his agency and attached everything available at that point. His own field notes, dispatch time markers, body cam preservation request, security camera request, witness information. He handled it the same way experienced investigators handle everything important. Clean timeline, no exaggeration, no emotional padding. Just facts lined up in order so nobody could hide inside confusion later. Boone's department didn't have much room to stall. The footage was public. The federal agency had already made contact. Internal Affairs opened an investigation the same week. Boone was put on administrative duty first, then moved off the street entirely, while the case was reviewed. The department tried the usual early language. They called it a concerning interaction. They said they were gathering facts. They promised a full review, standard damage control. The problem for them was that the facts were already visible, and the public could hear the officer making the wrong call in real time. Then more complaints surfaced. Not criminal cases, not huge headline scandals. Something more believable and more damaging. People from the same patrol area started describing Boone the same way. Quick to accuse, fast to escalate. Different tone depending on who he was talking to. More forceful with black drivers and pedestrians, less patient when challenged. The kind of pattern departments ignore until one video makes it impossible to keep ignoring. Internal Affairs pulled Bodycam from unrelated stops. They reviewed dispatch logs. They looked at prior complaints that had gone nowhere. That part always tells the real story. One ugly incident usually doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of a pattern someone tolerated. Adrian also moved on the civil side. He filed a civil rights claim centered on unlawful attempted detention, interference with federal duties, and discriminatory enforcement. He wasn't chasing drama. He was forcing the city to answer for what its officer had done in public with full documentation. His lawyers argued that Boone skipped basic identification steps and escalated based on appearance, not evidence. That claim got attention fast because the video backed it up better than any press release could. Boone, of course, tried to save himself. He gave a statement saying the vehicle looked suspicious, the conduct at the pump looked inconsistent, and the man involved did not immediately identify himself to his satisfaction. Weak defense. It put the problem right back on him. To his satisfaction is not a legal standard. Procedure is, Verification is. Supervisor notification is. Controlled escalation is. Boone had ignored all of that. The internal report came down hard. Investigators found that Boone made a criminal accusation before establishing basic facts, failed to verify identity through available channels, escalated to threats of force without sufficient cause, and attempted to interfere with credentials and operational materials after being told he was dealing with law enforcement. The report also flagged indicators of biased enforcement. They didn't need dramatic language. The sequence spoke for itself. He was suspended first. Then the department announced formal discipline and mandatory decertification review. His future on the job got shaky in a hurry. Once an officer is publicly tied to profiling, procedural failure, and dishonesty in judgment, every prosecutor, defense lawyer, and supervisor starts looking at him differently. That's the part some officers never think about when they're throwing their weight around in a parking lot. One bad stop can follow every case they ever touch after that. The city moved toward settlement talks on Adrian's claim before trial. Also not surprising, cases like that get expensive, and video makes them worse. The legal risk wasn't just the stop itself. It was the department's exposure if the review showed Boone had a known pattern and stayed on the street anyway. Then came the policy changes. The department issued a revised contact protocol for disputed identity situations involving plainclothes personnel, task force work, and interagency operations. Officers now had to pause and verify through dispatch and a supervisor before escalating to detention when someone credibly claimed official status. They also expanded bias review triggers for complaints tied to stops that began with unsupported criminal assumptions. Training got updated too, but training only matters if supervisors enforce it. That's where the real lesson sat. This whole thing wasn't caused by lack of information. Boone had plenty of options. He could have checked the plate. He could have contacted dispatch before accusing. He could have asked for a supervisor when Adrian said he was law enforcement. He could have stopped reaching once he saw credentials. He chose none of that because he trusted his own ego more than the job. And that's why the scene blew up. Adrian didn't become a celebrity from it. He didn't tour TV studios or turn the stop into some performance. He kept working. He gave his statements. He let the record do its work. People in his field respect that because they know how rare it is for somebody to stay that controlled while an officer tries to bully him in public. The bigger effect landed closer to home. Officers in Boone's department now had an example nobody could laugh off. Supervisors had a case they had to reference. Community members had proof for something they'd been saying for years. And younger officers watching the story understood the point immediately. If you walk into a scene with bias and attitude, cameras will finish what your bad judgment starts. That's what this story came down to. A patrol officer saw a black man at a gas pump and thought he could force the facts to fit his first assumption. He pushed hard, got reckless, and found out too late that confidence doesn't protect you when procedure collapses. Adrian didn't beat him by getting louder. He beat him by staying disciplined, knowing the rules, and making sure the record stayed clean. That's the whole power game in situations like this. The loudest person usually thinks he's winning. Then the footage gets reviewed, the timeline gets built, and all that false authority starts looking real small. What would you have done in Adrian's position? Have you ever seen an officer go aggressive before even checking the facts? Put your thoughts in the comments. Share the story with somebody who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories like this.
I asked you a question. Who are you and what are you doing here?
We already
Federal
told you.
law enforcement official business.
Then show me something I can actually verify.
There you go.
No, that's not enough.
Call it in then.
Don't tell me how to do my job.
Nobody's telling you anything. Verify it and move on.
No, here's what's going to happen. You're going to stand up and come
not
outside.
leaving
Then
this
you're
city.
obstructing.
This is why officers need to know the limits of their authority before they start throwing it around. When a patrol cop stormed into a roadside diner and tried to throw out two men he thought were suspicious drifters, he expected instant compliance. What he got instead was a calm refusal, 2 federal badges on the table, and the exact kind of public mistake that ends careers. Watch how fast the power shifted once his ego got ahead of his training. Before this goes any further, drop where you're watching from. City, state, country, wherever. And if you like stories about power trips getting checked by facts, hit like and subscribe. This one turned ugly fast, and it stayed ugly for the officer who caused it. This started in a diner that looked too ordinary for the kind of mess that was about to happen. It was late morning, local spot, highway traffic coming through, retirees at the counter, a waitress moving fast with coffee refills, a couple of truckers in a back booth. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud. The kind of place where people notice strangers, but not enough to make a scene unless someone gave them a reason. Two men had been sitting in a booth near the front windows for a while. Plain clothes, neutral jackets, no uniforms, no marked vehicles outside. They'd ordered coffee, something small to eat, and they'd barely touched either one after that. They weren't chatting much. They weren't staring at each other. They were watching the parking lot, the road, the entrance, and the reflection off the glass. People in that business always looked like they were doing nothing right up until it mattered. Those men were Deputy U.S. Marshals, Daniel Mercer and Elena Ruiz. They weren't there to eat. They were there because a fugitive tied to a federal warrant was expected to make contact in the lot outside. The diner gave them visibility, cover, and a believable reason to stay parked in one place without drawing attention. Standard surveillance choice: quiet, efficient, low profile. That was the plan. Then somebody in the diner decided the two quiet strangers looked wrong. It might have been a customer, might have been somebody behind the counter. Small towns do this all the time. Somebody sees two people sitting too long, not smiling enough, not acting familiar enough, and suddenly the whole thing becomes suspicious. Usually that goes nowhere. Sometimes an officer rolls by, asks a question, gets a simple answer, and moves on. That's what should have happened here. Instead, Officer Tyler Kessler walked in ready to dominate the room. He didn't come in curious. He came in aggressive. That mattered. The first few seconds told the whole story. He didn't scan the room and assess. He locked onto the booth immediately. Fast steps, hand already too close to his belt. Voice turned up for the audience. He wanted the room to know he had found the problem, and he was about to solve it. Mercer looked up once and knew what kind of officer this was. Not the cautious kind. Not the kind who asked himself what he might be missing. Kessler was the kind who decided first and investigated later. Bad habit in any job. Dangerous habit in law enforcement. Kessler stopped at the booth and started demanding answers. Identification. Purpose. Why they'd been sitting there. Why they were watching the entrance. Why the owner felt uncomfortable. He didn't ask those questions to gather facts. He asked them like he was already done listening. Mercer stayed seated. Ruiz stayed seated. Both of them kept it calm. They identified themselves as federal law enforcement engaged in official business. They told him there was no threat to the public and no need to disrupt the scene. They told him he could verify through proper channels if he needed confirmation. Clean, professional. Exactly what trained people say when they don't want to blow an active operation in front of a room full of civilians. Kessler didn't hear any of it the way it was said. He heard a challenge. That's where this went bad. Not because he was confused. Confusion can be fixed in 10 seconds. This was ego. He had walked in hot, and now he needed to prove he hadn't overplayed it. Officers like that get themselves in trouble because backing off feels worse to them than being wrong. Ruiz set her badge wallet where he could see it. Mercer did the same. Gold badges, federal credentials, not vague, not hidden, not some last-second reveal. They put the truth right in front of him and gave him a clean exit. All he had to do was pause, verify, lower his voice, and step out of the way. He didn't. He dismissed the badges almost instantly. Called them fake, or not good enough, or not relevant to what he called his scene. Different officers use different wording when they panic in public, but the move is always the same. Reject the evidence. Keep control of the moment. Don't let anybody see the doubt starting to creep in. The body camera would matter later because it caught that exact shift. You could see it. The second he realized they might actually be who they said they were, he got more forceful, not less. That's the tell. A disciplined officer slows down when uncertainty enters the picture. An insecure one speeds up. Mercer gave him another out. He repeated that verification could happen through dispatch. He explained in measured terms that they were on federal business and that removing them from the diner would interfere with an active investigation. Again, simple. Again, professional. Again, offering Kessler a chance to save face without blowing up the situation. Kessler took it personally. He started threatening obstruction. He started talking about trespass. He started acting like the diner booth was some kind of local battlefield where only his authority counted. That's what power trips look like in real time. They stop being about safety. They become emotional. The officer wants obedience more than accuracy, and the room felt it. Boom. The waitress stopped moving as fast. One of the truckers turned fully around in his seat. The owner looked nervous now, not because of the marshals, but because the officer had turned a manageable question into a public confrontation. A customer near the register started recording without making a show of it. Smart move. People have learned. When an officer comes in too loud and too certain, records matter. Mercer and Ruiz still didn't match his energy. That's another thing that made Kessler look worse. He was the only person escalating, the only person making it bigger, the only person refusing a normal off-ramp. He ordered them to stand up. They refused, not dramatically, not physically. They simply held position and repeated that they were engaged in official federal work and that his demand was improper. That kind of refusal hits an officer like Kessler harder than shouting ever could. He wanted a scene he could win. What he got was calm resistance backed by law, policy, and credentials he was too arrogant to verify. Then he made the mistake that changed the whole case. He radioed for backup and framed the situation like he was dealing with two non-compliant, suspicious subjects, possibly impersonating law enforcement. That was reckless for a few reasons. First, it contaminated the response. Now other officers were arriving with the wrong story in their heads. Second, it raised the stakes in a room full of civilians, while a federal surveillance operation was still active. Third, it created a recorded trail, dispatch logs, body cam, radio traffic, timestamps. Every bad decision now had a timestamp attached to it. Once that happens, cleanup gets hard. Ruiz tried one more time to stop the train before it hit the wall. She told him he was interfering with a marshal's operation. She told him he needed a supervisor before he made this worse. That wasn't a bluff. That was the last warning. Kessler didn't take it as a warning. He took it as disrespect. That was the moment his mask came off. He started talking like one of those officers who confuses a badge with ownership, like the town belonged to him, like jurisdiction was whatever he said it was. Like procedure only mattered when it protected his authority, not when it limited it. This happens more than departments like to admit. Training teaches one thing, ego teaches another. On a bad day, ego wins. And here's what made it even dumber. Mercer and Ruiz weren't trying to embarrass him. Not yet. They were trying to get through the assignment. They had no reason to flex, no reason to posture. The whole point of plainclothes surveillance is to stay invisible. Kessler forced the issue because he couldn't stand the idea that two quiet people at a diner didn't instantly answer to him. By the time the first backup unit pulled into the lot, the atmosphere inside had changed completely. Now it wasn't just a local officer bothering two strangers. Now it was a documented local federal confrontation inside a public business, with witnesses, video, radio traffic, and an officer who had already ignored visible credentials and doubled down anyway. That's when the real danger started. Because once more uniforms walked in, this could either get corrected immediately or become a career-ending disaster. And the person who decided that wasn't going to be Kessler anymore. it was going to be his supervisor. When Sergeant Monica Hale entered the diner, the scene was already bad for Kessler. He had two plainclothes marshals still seated, backup arriving on a false frame, civilians watching, and Bodycam recording everything. He had already ignored credentials and refused verification. That was the real problem, not the first approach. The refusal to correct it. Hale saw it fast. Kessler started talking first. He said the two men were suspicious, non-compliant, and possibly impersonating law enforcement. Haley let him get enough out to understand his position, then shifted to Mercer and Ruiz. They identified themselves again. Same calm, same facts. Federal law enforcement, active official business. Verification available immediately. Hale asked for credentials. Mercer handed them over. Ruiz did the same. Hale checked them and asked a few direct questions tied to assignment and chain. Both answered cleanly, no hesitation, no inconsistency. That ended the issue right there. The credentials were real. The officers were real. Kessler had been wrong. The smart move for him then would have been silence. He didn't take it. He kept arguing. He kept trying to justify the stop and the removal order. That made it worse. A mistaken approach can sometimes be explained. Refusing to back off after confirmation is much harder to defend. Hale shut that down immediately. She told him to step back. Then she told him to stop talking. That was the shift. A few minutes earlier, Kessler had been giving orders to everyone in the diner. Now his own supervisor was controlling him in front of backup, witnesses, and the marshals he had tried to throw out. Hale returned the credentials and gave a brief apology. Then she asked Mercer the question that mattered, whether the operation had been compromised. Mercer said the confrontation had disrupted surveillance and created unnecessary exposure around an active federal assignment. He didn't overstate it. He didn't need to. The damage was obvious. Kessler tried to defend himself again. He said he was investigating suspicious men and couldn't accept badges at face value. That argument died on contact with the facts. He had been offered verification. More than once. He refused it. That was on camera. Once that existed, good faith got weak fast. Hale moved to immediate damage control. She ordered Kessler to surrender his duty weapon to a senior officer on scene, pending administrative action. That was the moment he finally understood how serious it was. He hesitated, asked if she was serious. She repeated the order. He complied. Then she placed him on immediate administrative leave and removed him from the scene. That decision did two things at once. It de-escalated the local federal clash, and it created instant distance between the department and Kessler's conduct. Hale knew she needed that separation on record right away. Mercer and Ruiz stayed focused. No speeches, no attitude. They answered what needed answering and documented the interference. Hale asked what the marshals needed to reduce further damage. Mercer gave limited instructions, but the original surveillance position was already burned. That contrast finished Kessler. He had spent the entire encounter acting like jurisdiction was personal. Hale resolved the same situation in minutes by doing basic police work. Verify, assess, correct, contain. He was escorted out of the diner by another officer. By then, the record against him was already strong. His body cam showed the credentials. Radio traffic showed how he framed the marshals. Civilian video captured the public escalation. Hale had verified the IDs herself. Backup officers saw the correction happen live. That kind of timeline leaves very little room to hide. By the time he got back to the station, this wasn't just a bad scene in a diner. It was an internal affairs problem, a command staff problem, and a federal relationship problem. Once those three hit at the same time, careers usually don't recover. When Sergeant Monica Hale entered the diner, the scene was already bad for Kessler. He had two plainclothes marshals still seated, backup arriving on a false frame, civilians watching, and Bodycam recording everything. He had already ignored credentials and refused verification. That was the real problem, not the first approach, the refusal to correct it. Hale saw it fast. Kessler started talking first. He said the two men were suspicious, non-compliant, and possibly impersonating law enforcement. Hale let him get enough out to understand his position, then shifted to Mercer and Ruiz. They identified themselves again. Same calm, same facts. Federal law enforcement. Active official business. Verification available immediately. Hale asked for credentials. Mercer handed them over. Ruiz did the same. Hale checked them and asked a few direct questions tied to assignment and chain. Both answered cleanly. No hesitation, no inconsistency. That ended the issue right there. The credentials were real. The officers were real. Kessler had been wrong. The smart move for him then would have been silence. He didn't take it. He kept arguing. He kept trying to justify the stop and the removal order. That made it worse. A mistaken approach can sometimes be explained. Refusing to back off after confirmation is much harder to defend. Hale shut that down immediately. She told him to step back. Then she told him to stop talking. That was the shift. A few minutes earlier, Kessler had been giving orders to everyone in the diner. Now his own supervisor was controlling him in front of backup, witnesses, and the marshals he had tried to throw out. Hale returned the credentials and gave a brief apology. Then she asked Mercer the question that mattered, whether the operation had been compromised. Mercer said the confrontation had disrupted surveillance and created unnecessary exposure around an active federal assignment. He didn't overstate it. He didn't need to. The damage was obvious. Kessler tried to defend himself again. He said he was investigating suspicious men and couldn't accept badges at face value. That argument died on contact with the facts. He had been offered verification more than once. He refused it. That was on camera. Once that existed, good faith got weak fast. Hale moved to immediate damage control. She ordered Kessler to surrender his duty weapon to a senior officer on scene pending administrative action. That was the moment he finally understood how serious it was. He hesitated, asked if she was serious. She repeated the order. He complied. Then she placed him on immediate administrative leave and removed him from the scene. That decision did two things at once. It de-escalated the local federal clash, and it created instant distance between the department and Kessler's conduct. Hale knew she needed that separation on record right away. Mercer and Ruiz stayed focused. No speeches, no attitude. They answered what needed answering and documented the interference. Hale asked what the marshals needed to reduce further damage. Mercer gave limited instructions, but the original surveillance position was already burned. That contrast finished Kessler. He had spent the entire encounter acting like jurisdiction was personal. Hale resolved the same situation in minutes by doing basic police work. Verify, assess, correct, contain. He was escorted out of the diner by another officer. By then, the record against him was already strong. His Bodycam showed the credentials. Radio traffic showed how he framed the marshals. Civilian video captured the public escalation. Hale had verified the IDs herself. Backup officers saw the correction happen live. That kind of timeline leaves very little room to hide. By the time he got back to the station, this wasn't just a bad scene in a diner. It was an internal affairs problem, a command staff problem, and a federal relationship problem. Once those three hit at the same time, careers usually don't recover.
Fake credentials look fake to me. Don't try to fool me, you're under arrest.
They're valid. I identified myself. You still haven't told me what law I'm breaking.
I don't need fake credentials.
Fake? Come on, man.
Valid. Put your hands behind your back. You have
Want to
street
arrest
cred?
me? Because I'm black? That's why it seems suspicious to you?
This is why you need to know your rights. Officer Brandon Keller stopped a black man in uptown Charlotte and expected a quick, easy detention. What he got instead was a calm legal challenge from an FBI special agent who knew exactly what the officer could and could not do. The stop was recorded, reviewed, and it ended up exposing a pattern the department had ignored for years. Tell me where you're watching from, and if you follow stories about abuse of authority, legal accountability, and public exposure, like the video and subscribe. This started on a Friday evening in uptown Charlotte. The area was busy. Restaurants were filling up. People were heading to dinner, leaving offices, and moving through the sidewalks like they did every weekend. Daniel Navarro was one of them. He was walking to meet a colleague for dinner. He was not hiding, running, or bothering anyone. Brandon Keller stopped him anyway. Keller had been with the Charlotte Police Department for 6 years. By that point, he already had a history. Complaint after complaint had followed him, many tied to aggressive stops and profiling concerns. The department had noticed. That much became clear later. But instead of removing him from patrol or treating the pattern like a serious warning, supervisors kept giving him light corrections and sending him back out. That matters because this stop did not come out of nowhere. Keller had done versions of this before. He had already learned that the department was not going to stop him in any real way. When Keller approached Navarro, he demanded identification and claimed Navarro matched a vague description. That was the reason he gave. But he did not clearly explain what crime had happened, what specific suspect he was looking for, or what Navarro had done to justify being detained. Navarro did not argue for the sake of arguing. He stayed calm and asked the right question. He asked what law he was breaking. Keller did not have a clear answer. That should have ended the stop. It should have forced Keller to step back and move on. Instead, he pushed forward. He repeated the demand for identification and acted like the stop was already justified just because he had started it. Navarro still did not give him the reaction he wanted. He did not get loud. He did not panic. He did not give Keller anything he could use later to make the stop look reasonable. He stayed controlled and kept the issue where it belonged. What was the legal reason for the detention? Then Navarro identified himself as an FBI special agent. He showed valid credentials, real credentials. That gave Keller a chance to correct himself. He could have checked them, realized he had gone too far, and ended the encounter before it got worse. He did not do that. Keller said the credentials were fake. That was the point where the stop moved from questionable to serious. A local officer had stopped a man without clear cause, failed to explain the legal basis, and then refused to accept valid federal credentials, because backing down would mean admitting he had been wrong. Keller then grabbed Navarro and tried to force the stop into an arrest. People nearby started paying attention. It was a public sidewalk in a busy part of the city. A confrontation like that was not going to stay unnoticed. Witnesses slowed down. Some stopped completely. Then phones came out. That changed the situation. Once bystanders started recording, Keller was no longer just dealing with Navarro. He was creating a record of his own conduct. His words, his tone, his lack of justification, the physical escalation. All of it was now being captured by people who had no reason to protect him. Navarro stayed composed. That was important. Keller was trying to control the scene through pressure. Navarro kept forcing the issue back to the law. He had done nothing suspicious. Keller could not explain a valid basis for detention. The credentials were real. The arrest attempt had no legal support. The more Keller pushed, the worse it looked. And this was not just about one bad decision in one moment. The reason this incident mattered so much is that Keller had already built a pattern. Internal records later showed he had received 11 complaints in 6 years. Many involved similar stops of black professionals in upscale neighborhoods. Same kind of target, same kind of setting, same aggressive approach. Supervisors had seen enough to recognize the pattern. They just had not acted in a meaningful way. That background was not visible to the crowd on the sidewalk yet, but it was already part of the story. Keller was acting like a man who had been allowed to do this before. Then Sergeant Linda Mercer arrived. She stepped into a scene that was already tense and already public. She saw Keller, Navarro, the witnesses, and the phones recording. She checked the credentials. She looked at what witnesses had captured. It did not take long to understand that Keller had stopped Navarro without a clear legal basis and then escalated after being challenged. At that point, Keller's version was falling apart in real time. Sergeant Linda Mercer did not treat it like a misunderstanding. She treated it like a scene that needed to be checked fast and documented correctly. She looked at Navarro's credentials herself. They were valid. She listened to the basic sequence of events. She checked what witnesses had already recorded. The problem was obvious. Keller had stopped Navarro without a clear legal basis, rejected valid identification, and escalated to physical force when he could not justify the detention. Mercer shut it down. She ordered Keller away from Navarro and took control of the stop. That mattered. Keller had been trying to keep the situation inside his own version of events. Mercer broke that immediately. Once another supervisor stepped in, checked the credentials, and saw the witness video, Keller lost control of the scene. Navarro was released there on the spot. That ended the street confrontation, but it started the real problem for the department. By that point, several bystanders had clear footage. It showed Navarro staying calm. It showed Keller pressing the stop without explaining a valid reason. It showed the situation getting worse instead of better after Navarro identified himself. Keller had no clean way to explain that video. The department did not have a clean way to defend it either. Keller was suspended almost immediately. That quick suspension told its own story. Departments usually move fast only when the facts are bad, public, and easy to understand. This one checked all three boxes. A federal agent had been stopped without cause in a busy part of Charlotte. Witnesses had recorded it. A supervisor had confirmed on scene that the credentials were real. There was no room to turn it into a vague internal dispute. Then the background started coming out. Once internal reviewers and city attorneys looked deeper, they found that Keller was not a surprise problem. He was a repeated problem. He had already collected 11 complaints in 6 years. Many of those complaints involved stops with the same basic pattern: black professionals, upscale or business districts, weak reasons for detention, aggressive behavior once challenged. That changed the meaning of the whole incident. Now, it was not just about one officer making one unlawful stop. It was about why he was still in position to do it after so many warnings. Supervisors had seen enough to recognize the pattern long before Navarro was stopped in uptown Charlotte. Internal records showed that leadership knew Keller's name, knew the complaint history, and knew the types of allegations tied to him. They responded with minor training and no serious discipline. That is how departments create their own scandals. They do not always create them by defending bad conduct after the fact. Sometimes they create them much earlier by tolerating it over and over until the wrong officer picks the wrong target in the wrong place at the wrong time. And Keller had picked the worst possible target for a bad stop. Navarro was not just someone who knew his rights in a general sense. He worked in federal law enforcement. He understood detention standards. He understood how reports get written. He understood how civil rights cases are built. He also understood that a calm record is stronger than an angry argument. So he did what experienced people do when a system shows its hand. He documented everything and moved it to a forum where Keller could not control the facts. The witness video spread quickly, first local, then wider. People in Charlotte started reacting not just to the stop itself, but to the pattern behind it. Black professionals spoke about similar encounters. Residents recognized the location type immediately. Upscale areas, business areas, places where certain officers treated black presence as suspicion by default. That public reaction mattered because it showed the department was dealing with more than one complaint from one victim. The video gave other people a reference point. It made older complaints look less isolated and more credible. Once that happens, leadership loses one of its favorite excuses. They can no longer pretend each case stood alone. Inside the department, supervisors had another problem. Mercer's intervention had made it harder to bury the details. This was not an incident where everyone on scene backed Keller's version. A sergeant had already stepped in, checked the credentials, and seen that Keller's basis for the stop did not hold together. That meant the city would have to account not only for what Keller did, but for what Mercer had already recognized in real time. And once lawyers got involved, that became very expensive. Because civil rights cases do not stop at the officer if the facts show a pattern. They move up. They ask who knew. They ask when they knew it. They ask what they did after repeated complaints. They ask why an officer with that record was still on patrol doing the same kind of stop. Those questions are harder for a department to answer than the stop itself. Navarro filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against Keller, Keller's supervisors, and the Charlotte Police Department. That filing forced the issue out of internal language and into legal language. Internal language gives departments space. Legal language strips that away. A complaint is no longer a workplace matter or a training issue. It becomes a record of alleged constitutional violations, supervisory failure, and institutional neglect. The city then had to look at the full risk. Not just the video, not just Keller's actions, the history, the prior complaints, the notice to supervisors, the failure to intervene earlier, the public setting, the credibility of the victim, the fact that Mercer had confirmed the stop was wrong before the scene even ended. That is where the department's real exposure was sitting. Keller had created the incident. Leadership had created the conditions for it to happen again and again. That is the part many departments hate the most, because it is harder to isolate. Firing one officer later does not erase years of warnings. It does not erase ignored complaint patterns. It does not erase decisions by supervisors who saw the risk and kept him on patrol anyway. By then, Keller's career was already collapsing. Suspension was only the start. The evidence against him was too direct, and his history made it worse instead of softer. What might have been called a disputed stop in another case now looked like part of a documented pattern, and the department could see where this was headed. The department could see where it was headed, but by then it was too late to contain it. Navarro's lawsuit put the whole chain under pressure. Not just Keller, his supervisors too. The complaint argued that Keller violated Navarro's civil rights during the stop, then tried to force an arrest without legal grounds. It also went after the people above him for allowing an officer with a known pattern of misconduct to stay on patrol. That second part was the real danger for the city. A bad stop by one officer is damaging. A bad stop tied to years of ignored warnings is worse. Once internal records showed Keller had already drawn 11 complaints in 6 years, the issue got much bigger than one Friday night in uptown Charlotte. The case now had a timeline. It had repeated notice. It had a pattern supervisors had every chance to address and chose not to stop in any serious way. That is how the city ended up settling. The settlement was $4 million. Cities do not pay that kind of money because of a simple misunderstanding. They pay when the facts are hard to defend, the record is bad, and the risk of going further is even worse. In this case, the city was looking at witness video, a federal agent with valid credentials, a stop with no clear legal basis, an attempted arrest that did not hold up, and a complaint history that made Keller impossible to describe as an isolated problem. Keller was fired. He also lost his certification, which ended his ability to work in law enforcement again. That part mattered. Departments sometimes remove officers quietly and leave the door open for them to land somewhere else. This case did not end that way. Keller did not just lose one job. He lost the authority that came with the badge. But the story did not stop with him, and it should not. Keller was the visible problem. The deeper problem sat above him. Supervisors had already seen enough to act. They had the complaints. They had the recurring allegations. They had the location pattern, the type of stops, and the repeated accusations involving black professionals in upscale neighborhoods. They knew enough to understand the risk. They chose soft responses anyway. That failure became part of the public reckoning. The fallout forced changes inside the department. Complaint review systems were tightened, so repeated allegations could not be brushed aside as separate, unrelated incidents. Early warning tracking was strengthened to flag officers who kept drawing the same types of complaints. Outside oversight was added so the department was not left to police its own patterns in private. Public reporting requirements were also put in place, which made it harder to bury warning signs behind internal language. That is what real pressure does. It forces systems to create records they cannot easily hide later. And this is the point people should pay attention to. Keller did not suddenly become reckless on the night he stopped Navarro. He had been given room to operate like that for years. The stop in uptown Charlotte became a scandal because it finally happened in a setting the department could not control. Wrong target, public location, witnesses recording, immediate supervisory review, federal lawsuit, financial consequences. That combination forced honesty. Navarro's role in that mattered too. He did not save himself by shouting louder than Keller. He did not try to win the moment with attitude. He stayed controlled, stayed clear, and kept the issue tied to the law. Then he moved the fight to the place where records, patterns, and accountability mattered more than one officer's version of events. That is usually where these cases are really decided. Not on the sidewalk. Not in the first report. In the record that follows. By the end of it, Keller lost his career. The city paid millions. The department was pushed into reforms it should have made long before Navarro was ever stopped. And the public got a clear view of what the real issue was. Not one bad choice by one officer on one night. A system saw repeated misconduct, recognized the pattern, and let it continue until exposure made inaction impossible. That is the lesson here. A lot of abuse survives because institutions protect it through delay, excuses, and weak internal discipline. It keeps going until somebody documents it well enough, challenges it clearly enough, and forces the cost into public view. That is what happened here. So, what would you have done in Navarro's position? Have you ever seen a situation where an official kept pushing only because they were used to nobody stopping them? Put your thoughts in the comments. Share the story with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe for more stories like this.
Turn around, hands behind your back.
Wait, why?
You didn't stop, you kept going.
I slowed down and pulled.
Stop talking, turn around.
I'm not trying to fight you, I'm trying to explain.
Ethan.
It's okay, stay in the car.
This is why people need to understand their rights before a bad stop turns into a life-changing one. Broward County Deputy Ryan Mercer thought he was dealing with two scared teenagers he could pressure into silence on the side of the road. He did not expect the facts to start working against him almost immediately. And he definitely did not expect this stop to end with a lawsuit, a multi-million-dollar settlement, and his career blown apart. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you follow stories about abuse of power, legal accountability, and people keeping calm when an officer gets out of line, like this video, and subscribe. By the time the stop got serious, Ethan Carter was already in handcuffs, and his sister Maya was sitting in the car in shock. That's how fast it happened. Ethan was a high school student on his way to school with his younger sister. It was a normal morning in Broward County. He was driving. She was in the passenger seat. Nothing about that drive suggested they were about to get pulled into a police stop that would later cost the county $2 million. The problem started with something simple. Deputy Ryan Mercer wanted Ethan to stop, but he did not start with a clear traffic stop. He had no lights on, no siren, no unmistakable signal that any driver would immediately read as a command to pull over. He used a hand motion. Ethan saw that gesture and understood it as a signal to move over or change lanes. So he did exactly that. He kept driving in a normal way because he thought he had followed the instruction. That misunderstanding should have been easy to fix. A competent officer in that situation turns on the lights, hits the siren, makes the stop clear, and then figures out whether the driver was confused or refusing to comply. That is basic. Mercer did not handle it that way. He waited until later to activate the siren. The second Ethan heard it and realized this was an actual stop, he pulled over. That should have settled the issue. It should have become a routine traffic stop with a short explanation. Ethan could have told him he misunderstood the hand signal. Mercer could have checked the license, written a warning or citation if he wanted, and moved on. Instead, Mercer treated the stop like Ethan had committed a felony. He moved in aggressively, pulled Ethan out of the car, handcuffed him, and accused him of fleeing. He did not slow the situation down. He did not ask basic questions first. He did not give Ethan room to explain what had happened before turning physical. That decision changed everything. Now, this was no longer a traffic misunderstanding. Now a teenager on his way to school was standing on the roadside in handcuffs while a deputy pushed a felony accusation that did not match the facts. Ethan tried to explain. He said he did not know Mercer wanted him to stop earlier. He said he thought the hand motion meant move over, not pull over. He said he stopped as soon as the siren came on. Mercer did not listen. That matters because this is where officers either correct a mistake or make it worse. Mercer had enough information to realize Ethan's explanation made sense. There had been no lights or siren at first. The driver had stopped once the stop became clear. There was no obvious sign of panic, no wild driving, no effort to get away. But Mercer had already decided he was dealing with felony flight. And once he locked himself into that position, he treated Ethan's explanation like a challenge instead of evidence. Maya was watching all of this from the passenger seat. She saw her brother pulled out of the car and cuffed on the way to school. She heard the deputy talking to him like he was some dangerous suspect. At that point, she stopped thinking this was a misunderstanding that would clear itself up. She understood something was wrong, so she called their mother. That call made Mercer even more hostile. Their mother was Danielle Carter, a federal judge. Maya reached out because she needed help, and because the stop had already gone beyond anything that looked normal. Once Mercer found out who was on the phone, he did not calm down and make sure every step he took was legally solid. He got more aggressive. That told everyone exactly what kind of stop this had become. He argued with their mother on the phone instead of sticking to the facts of the stop. He turned the situation personal. Then he took Maya's phone even though she was not a threat and was not creating any danger. That was a major mistake. Maya was a frightened teenager calling her mother while her brother was in handcuffs. Taking her phone did not make the scene safer. It did not help Mercer investigate anything. It showed he wanted control more than clarity, and the facts were already moving against him. There was no legal basis for treating Ethan like a fleeing felon. Ethan had not taken off after a clearly marked stop. He had not ignored lights and siren. He had not kept driving after the stop became unmistakable. He pulled over once Mercer activated the siren. On top of that, there was no criminal issue on his license that explained some desperate attempt to escape. Mercer was trying to force a serious charge onto a situation that did not support it. Ethan stayed focused and kept giving the same explanation. He had misunderstood the gesture. He had not run. He had stopped when the siren came on. Mercer had a problem now. The longer he held onto the felony story, the worse it looked. Every minute made it harder to explain why he had skipped normal procedure and gone straight to force. At some point, he had to back off. He removed the handcuffs. That move made one thing clear. Mercer could not support the arrest he had started. If Ethan had really fled from a lawful stop, that case would not disappear on the roadside after a few checks and a few minutes of pressure. Mercer had gone too far and knew it. But he still did not admit it. Instead, he wrote a citation. That was not a real fix. It was an attempt to leave the scene with something official in his hand after the felony accusation fell apart. Ethan and Maya were still left with the same reality. Ethan had been yanked out of the car, cuffed, and accused of a felony on the way to school. Maya had been frightened, cut off from her mother, and forced to watch the whole thing happen. A citation did not undo any of that. By the time the stop ended, both teenagers understood they had just been through something far more serious than an officer losing his temper for a minute. This was abuse of authority dressed up as enforcement. And Mercer had made another mistake he probably did not appreciate yet. He had created a stop that could be checked from every direction. The timing of the signals, the lack of lights and siren at the start, Ethan stopping once the siren came on, the handcuffs, the felony accusation, the phone call with their mother, the seizure of Maya's phone, the final retreat from arrest to citation. That kind of stop does not stay buried if the family has the means and the discipline to challenge it. The Carters did. Once they got home and laid out what happened step by step, this was no longer just a bad morning on the road. It was the beginning of a case that would put Mercer's decisions under a microscope and force Broward County to answer for what he did. Once the Carter family got home, they did not treat this like a bad traffic stop that would fade after a few angry conversations. They treated it like a case. That was the right move. A lot of people lose these situations before they even begin because they rely on outrage instead of structure. They tell the story emotionally, skip details, and leave room for the officer's report to become the official version. The Carters did the opposite. They started locking down the timeline. Ethan explained the drive from the beginning. He described the first moment he noticed Mercer, the hand motion, what he thought it meant, and the point when the siren finally came on. Maya filled in what she saw from the passenger seat. She described the stop from her angle, Ethan getting pulled out, the handcuffs, Mercer's tone, the phone call to their mother, and Mercer taking her phone. Their mother already knew what mattered. Not assumptions, not dramatic language, sequence. Exact actions, exact timing. What signal came first? When Ethan pulled over, what Mercer said the basis was. When the handcuffs went on, when they came off. Why Maya's phone got taken. What citation got written after the felony claim collapsed. That's how a weak police narrative starts falling apart, piece by piece. Danielle Carter also understood something else. A deputy can say a driver fled. That does not make it true. If the stop began with no lights, no siren, and only a vague hand motion, the whole legal theory gets shaky fast. If the driver then pulls over once the siren comes on, it gets even worse for the deputy. If the deputy reacts by escalating, grabbing, cuffing, and pushing a felony accusation without solid grounds, then the department has a serious problem. The family moved quickly, and they preserved everything they could. Notes, call history, the citation, their own memory while it was still fresh. That mattered because details disappear fast after adrenaline wears off. People start rounding things off. Times blur together. Sequences get less precise. The Carters did not let that happen. Then they pushed the complaint forward. This is where a lot of departments hope people get tired. They count on families backing off after the first emotional crash. They count on fear, delay, and the usual feeling that fighting law enforcement is too expensive, too slow, too stacked against normal people. Mercer probably thought this would end that way too. He had the badge. He had the first shot at the report. He had the usual advantage officers get when a roadside stop turns into paperwork. But this was not a family that was going to let a false version settle into the record. The internal review process started with the same basic issue Mercer should have solved on the roadside. What exactly made him think Ethan had committed felony fleeing? That question did not help him, because now he had to explain why a hand motion without lights or siren was supposed to count as a clear command to stop. He had to explain why Ethan pulling over once the siren came on did not end the matter. He had to explain why he jumped past ordinary traffic stop procedure and went straight to force. He had to explain why Maya's phone got taken. He had to explain why the stop ended with a citation instead of the felony arrest he had acted out in real time. The more people looked at it, the worse it got. That is usually how these cases work. The stop may look confusing in the moment, because one side has all the authority and all the pressure is flowing one way. Later, once the emotion gets stripped out and the sequence gets reviewed, the bad decisions start standing alone. Clean. Hard to defend? Mercer had made several. First, he failed to make the stop clear at the start. That set up the misunderstanding. Second, once Ethan stopped after the siren, Mercer treated the earlier confusion like proof of criminal intent, instead of checking whether the explanation fit the facts. Third, he escalated physically before establishing a sound legal basis for the arrest posture he was taking. Fourth, he made the stop worse after learning who their mother was. That part was especially ugly because it suggested this was no longer about enforcement. It was about pride. Fifth, he grabbed Maya's phone even though she posed no threat. Each one of those decisions had its own problem. Together, they painted a very bad picture. The family's legal team saw it the same way. This was not just a bad judgment call. It was a false arrest and an excessive force claim with emotional distress consequences built into the facts. Ethan had been handcuffed and accused of a felony without a lawful basis. Maya had been aggressively detained in the middle of an already chaotic stop and cut off from her mother, even though she had done nothing wrong. That is how a traffic stop becomes civil liability. And once lawyers get involved, officers lose one big advantage. They no longer get to rely on tone and presence. Nobody cares about roadside swagger in a lawsuit. The case becomes documents, testimony, policy, timing, and whether the officer's story still holds together when every step gets tested. Mercer's did not. The complaint laid out the core issue clearly. Ethan had not fled. He had misunderstood an unclear gesture before any lights or siren were used. He stopped once the siren came on. Mercer then used force without proper justification, escalated the situation, and interfered with Maya while she was trying to contact their mother during a stop that was already out of control. That is a strong case because it does not rely on exaggeration. It relies on sequence, and sequence is hard to spin. The county had to look at more than Mercer's initial claim now. They had to think about what a jury would see if this went all the way. 2 students on a school commute, a deputy using a vague gesture instead of a clear stop, a siren coming later, a teenager pulling over once the stop became obvious, immediate handcuffing, a felony accusation that did not match the facts, a sister calling her mother in fear, a federal judge on the phone, the deputy getting more hostile, not less. Then the retreat from arrest to citation. That story had a very obvious weakness. It made Mercer look like he was trying to force the facts to fit his reaction. Departments hate cases like that because they are hard to clean up. And there was another problem for Mercer. Even if someone wanted to defend the initial misunderstanding as a split-second judgment issue, the later decisions kept making things worse. He had opportunities to correct course. More than one. He did not take them. That matters in these cases. A single bad read can sometimes be explained. Repeated escalation after new facts come in is harder to excuse. Ethan and Maya also had to deal with the personal side while all this was building. That part gets overlooked a lot, but it matters. Ethan still had to go back to school after being treated like a criminal on the way there. Maya still had to live with the memory of watching her brother cuffed while an armed deputy took over the scene. These stops do not end when the patrol car leaves. They stay with people. The embarrassment stays. The anger stays. The change in how safe, ordinary things feel stays. The family did not let that part get minimized. They made clear that this was not only about a bad charge or an improper citation. It was about what Mercer did to 2 teenagers during a routine morning and what that kind of conduct does to a person after the scene is over. That raised the stakes. Now, the county was not just looking at whether Mercer had made a technical error. They were looking at false arrest, excessive force, emotional distress, and a fact pattern that could play very badly in public if it ever moved beyond legal filings and into wider attention. Mercer was no longer controlling the story. That shift matters. On the roadside, he had total control. He controlled the tone, the movement, the pressure, and the immediate consequences. Afterward, control started moving away from him, into records, into policy review, into legal claims, into a setting where authority means less than proof, and proof was becoming a problem for him. By this point, the family was not asking whether they should act. They were already acting. The real question was how far this would go, and whether Broward County would fight the case or try to make it disappear before more damage hit the department. Because once the paperwork, testimony, and review started lining up, one thing was becoming clear. Ryan Mercer had turned a simple misunderstanding into a case that could cost the county a lot of money and cost him his job. The lawsuit forced the county to deal with the stop as it actually happened, not as Mercer tried to frame it on the roadside. The main issue was simple. Ethan did not flee. Mercer had not made a clear stop at first. He used a hand motion without lights or siren. Ethan read that as a signal to change lanes and kept going. Once the siren came on, he pulled over. That sequence destroyed the felony theory. Mercer had treated confusion as intent. That was the first major problem. The second was what he did after Ethan stopped. Instead of handling it like a traffic stop, he pulled Ethan out, handcuffed him, and accused him of a felony. By the end of the stop, he had to remove the cuffs because there was no solid basis for that arrest posture. Then there was Maya. She called their mother because she was scared by what Mercer was doing. Mercer responded by arguing on the phone and taking Maya's phone even though she was not a threat. That made the stop worse and widened the case. The family sued over false arrest, excessive force, and emotional distress. Those claims fit the facts. Ethan had been detained like a fleeing suspect without legal grounds. Maya had been aggressively controlled during a stop where she had done nothing wrong. The county had to look at the full sequence, and the full sequence was bad for Mercer. His actions created a clear pattern. He misread the situation, escalated too fast, refused to correct himself, then tried to leave the scene with a citation after the felony accusation fell apart. That did not hold up. The case ended with a $3 million settlement for Ethan and Maya. Mercer was fired for gross misconduct. That outcome settled the core issue. Ethan was not a student who ran from police. He was a student wrongly arrested after a deputy turned a misunderstanding into a power move. Maya was not just standing nearby. What Mercer did to her counted too. The settlement closed the legal case, but it also made the result public, in the only way that really matters in cases like this. The county paid $3 million to Ethan and Maya Carter. That number mattered because it showed the case was serious. This was not treated like a minor stop or a small judgment error. The county was paying for false arrest, excessive force, and the harm Mercer caused both teenagers during a routine school drive. Mercer was also fired for gross misconduct. That ended the other argument too. He was not leaving this as a deputy who made a tough call under pressure. He lost his job because his conduct could not be defended once the facts were reviewed in order. For Ethan, the result corrected the record. He was never a fleeing suspect. He was a student who misunderstood an unclear hand motion, stopped once the siren came on, and got treated like a felon by a deputy who refused to slow down and assess the situation properly. For Maya, the outcome mattered because what happened to her was recognized as part of the abuse, not some extra detail around Ethan's stop. She was frightened, aggressively controlled, and had her phone taken even though she was not a threat. That is what made this case bigger than one bad stop. Mercer had all the power at the start. He had the badge, the roadside control, and the ability to force his version in real time. The Carters beat that by doing the opposite of what he expected. They stayed calm, kept the sequence straight, and challenged every part of the story that did not match the facts. That is why this case still matters. A deputy tried to turn confusion into felony flight. He tried to use force to hold that version together. He failed because the timeline was clear, the family acted fast, and the law did not support what he did. That is the lesson here. Knowing your rights does not always stop abuse in the moment.